Playing the wrong tune in the wrong key. Gig nightmares for you and me. Song changed keys and I wasn't ready. Gig nightmares for you and me. Another key change, oh God, oh no. Gig nightmares for you and me.
All right, Gig Nightmares. Here we are today with a very special guest, Mr. Jimmy Waldo of Alcatrazz, New England, Blackthorne, Warlord. You played keys for Quiet Riot at one point. How many different projects have you been a part of?
I don't know number-wise, but I think you named them. There's a few others that I've played on a record or two, but actual like Quiet Riot, I wrote and recorded and toured with those guys. Warlord, same thing. I did the album, recorded the album, and then we toured, and we're going to continue to do more stuff. There's a lot more dates coming up. We're going to Japan in March. Then I'm working with a band called A to Z. I don't know if you're familiar with that. They had an album out a couple of years ago that did really well, actually. It's Ray. What's Ray's last name? Anyway, it's Ray and Mark Zonder, the drummer from Fate's Warning. If you remember Fate's Warning at all.
Yeah.
Well, it's those guys, and they don't use the name Fate's Warning, so they call it A to Z. Ray Alder, that's it, and Mark Zonder, so A to Z. But that's with Philip Bino plays bass and Warlord, and also Philip played on the A to Z thing, and Zonder plays drums in Warlord because he was Warlord with Bill before Bill passed away.
Mm-hmm.
So it's he and I and Philip Bino and A to Z plus some guitar players, and Ray's obviously singing. So that album's done. That album will be out in the spring, and going to LA next month to do 2 videos and shoot a photo session for that project. And then Warlord is going to be, we go to Japan in March and then play a big festival in Texas, which will be really cool in March. And then Alcatrazz, there's a bunch of stuff on the books. I don't know what all yet, but so.
That's awesome. I mean, it's great to be staying busy. And well, also, I mean, it's just a pleasure to be talking to you again. I think I told you before, but the show back in April when I saw you, me and my one buddy drove something like 8 hours out to see the show.
I know. You told me that then. I could not believe it. Wow. But, when I think back, I did the same thing. When I first had my first bands and stuff, I mean, we drove hours to see bands. So yeah, I get it, but that's amazing. I appreciate that.
Hey, it was worth it. I mean, I think I mentioned back then, I'm a huge Yngwie fan. So when I saw the initial tour announcement, I was thinking, no matter what I do, I have to see that show. Like, because it was the Wednesday, like my normal band 80s Revolution, we have rehearsals on Wednesdays and then usually have shows on Saturdays. And those were the 2 closest shows, Philadelphia and New York. So, hey, Pittsburgh, here we go, road trip.
Right. Road trip to Pittsburgh.
Yep. So while I was doing research for this, there's just so many amazing things that you've done that I think most people aren't really aware of. Like, I mean, just looking at Alcatrazz alone, you have Graham Bonnet, Yngwie Malmsteen, Steve Vai, Doogie White, Danny Johnson, Joe Stump, just to name a few distinguished alumni. And then, with New England being managed by Bill O'Coin, who managed Kiss, you got to open for Kiss. You played Madison Square Garden, open for Rush, Kansas, Styx, AC/DC, Journey. Like you've just been there for so much of it. It's amazing.
Yeah, those were great experiences. And the coolest thing about it is all those bands are really cool people. And we were new on the scene at the time, so we didn't know what to expect. I mean, Kiss, we knew because we were managed by Bill, and Paul Stanley produced our first record with Mike Stone. So we knew Paul really well. We liked him a lot. Really cool guy. So the whole band was great. So Kiss was super nice people. But So was Journey, Styx, Kansas. They were all really nice. Rush, those were some of the nicest guys. I mean, that was really cool to be on the road. And that first gig, you're playing in front of 20,000 people or whatever, and you don't know these people. I never met Rush. I didn't know anything about them, and they just couldn't have been nicer. So, and the guys in Kiss, they treated us great. I mean, we got treated really, really good. They're real pros. So, you hear different people have different opinions about Kiss, and I got nothing but good things to say about them, because it was all good experience. Touring with them and working with Paul was a lot of fun, and he brought a lot to the party. So
Sure.
it's great.
And then, while maintaining that relationship with Gene Simmons, you got to work with Vinnie Vincent for a little while.
Yeah, that was, New England broke up, and we were going to replace John Famine, the singer-songwriter, at first. And so we were looking for a replacement. So I was in Boston, so I called Gene, because Gene knows every musician on earth. So I just called Gene. I said, hey, we need a guitar player. And Gene said, I got the guy, and gave me Vinny's number. I called Vinny from Boston, and Vinny said, well, I don't really want to be in New England. He said, but let's just start. I've written stuff. I've got 5 songs. I'll send you, in those days, I'll send you a tape. So he sent us a cassette. We learned, Gary and I and Hirsch learned the 5 songs. And then Vinny flew to Boston, and we had our own rehearsal place. So he just flew to Boston, plugged in a Marshall, and we played. And it sounded great. So Vinny goes, this is great. You guys got to move to LA. So I was out of there. After New England broke up, nobody had to convince me to move out of Boston. I love Boston, but as a city, but not as a musical place for me anyway. So we all moved to LA, and I stayed. Gary Shea was there for a while, but Purge went back after the Vinnie Vincent thing fell apart. And Gary stayed for a while, and then Gary and I did Alcatrazz.
So putting Alcatrazz together, because that's also an interesting story, just the number of people auditioning for guitar, auditioning for drums. I read that Clive Burr from Iron Maiden auditioned. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I forget who put that, our manager basically put that together, and Clive flew over from England, and we worked together for about a week at rehearsal. Nicest guy. Really, really cool guy, and a very good drummer, but just not the right drummer at all for the band. And we rehearsed a lot, actually, with him, learning songs and stuff, but it just wasn't working. And we tried to make it work, because at the time, it was a big deal to have, the drummer from Iron Maiden. That would have been a big deal.
Sure.
I don't think it means much, really, nowadays. It's no offense to, God rest him, Clive Burr, but I don't think people buying records, for the most part, don't really care who's on the record, I mean, if it's Steve Perry from Journey and he's singing, they care about that, but who plays drums or keyboards or guitar, most of the time they just don't care. It's like, is it good or not good? And that's the way we looked at it, because Yngwie and I were writing together at the time, and we talked about it, just he and I, and Yngwie goes, yeah, it just doesn't feel good, just doesn't feel right. He said, I love the guy, but it just doesn't feel right. And I felt the same way. So it didn't matter, Clive Burr from Iron Maiden or whatever, it just didn't matter. It's got to be right musically. It just wasn't.
So getting to the topic of this show, Gig Nightmares, I'm curious to hear some of the stories, just about things that are publicly available, and then like things I've heard you mention on other interviews. Like, for example, I heard something about New England having a gig booked in Canada, driving 5 hours to the gig and finding out that the venue doesn't even book bands. Can you talk about that story?
I vaguely remember it, but yeah, in those days, we had a booking agent who was located in New Hampshire, I think he was. Great guy, but he would put shows, he would put, book gigs, and some of those clubs he'd never been to, so he didn't know. So around New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts, he knew the scene pretty well. But Canada, he didn't really. He just, he booked some clubs that he'd never been to. So we went to this venue, and there was no club. It was just an address. So we'd driven all that way up into Canada, and there was nothing. We didn't play. It was pretty funny. We had some funny experiences in Canada, actually. That was as a bar band. This was pre-New England as a bar band. And we used to play clubs up there all the time. And in the summer, you'd play these clubs, and they'd be, it's beautiful. I mean, the country's beautiful, and you're kind of way out in the sticks sometimes. But it'd be like 1,000-seat club, and it would get packed.
Wow.
And you're just like, where do these people come from? If you're not near a big city, really. So what we used to play these places. So in the wintertime, we went back to play this one place that we played at before and did really well. So it was snowing. I mean, it was really snowing. So we started playing. There's nobody in the club. The roads were impassable. I mean, so nobody could get there. And this was serious snowstorm. So we played a couple of sets, a couple hours. And finally the owner came up and he goes, come on, guys, let's get out of here. He goes, there's nobody going to show up. He said, I'm going to close. I'll pay you. Don't worry about it. So he says, we'll go to a strip club. And so we were all up for that. We said, how are we going to get there? He says, oh, don't worry about it. It's okay. So we all piled into this guy's old Oldsmobile. He had a big Oldsmobile, huge car. We all get in that, and we're all drunk, and we're all drinking. And he takes off down the road, and the snow drifts were about 10 feet high on each side of the road, where they'd plowed and plowed and plowed and just kept stacking up. And there was just a path, basically. You couldn't really see any asphalt. And he's driving at 80 miles an hour, and it's snowing. And no thought to like, well, what if another car was coming the other way? We didn't even, it was just like we're drinking and having fun. So finally, we drove for like 20 miles, and he pulls into like a little motel. It looked like the Bates Motel from Psycho. And there's a little neon sign that says bar at the motel. So we go in. There's about 3 people in this bar at the hotel. Basically, it's the lobby of this little Motel 6 kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You walk in the lobby, and it's like right there. There's about 5 tables, and there's a little bar, and there's 4 or 5 people in there maybe drinking. So we said to the owner, this is a strip club? He goes, oh, yeah, it's really cool. So we sit down, and this middle-aged lady, she comes over to our table, takes her drink orders, comes back with her drinks. And then I asked the owner again, I said, so where's the strip club part? And he goes, you'll see. This woman, she wasn't skinny, I'll just put it that way. And she puts money in the jukebox. She puts down her tray of drinks. She takes her clothes off and starts dancing around the room.
Oh.
And I mean, it was, we were laughing so hard, and I felt bad because I guess she probably thought we were laughing at her, and we just laughing at the situation, but this lady would dance, and then she would maybe 2 or 3 songs. She'd go over and put more money in the jukebox and then dance more. And then the song would run out. So she would put her clothes back on right there in front of everybody. I mean, just put her clothes on and then continue serving drinks. And then half hour later, she would do the same thing. She'd take her clothes off, and then she'd pick her songs on the jukebox and go through 3 or 4 songs with no clothes on. Her clothes just laying on the floor. I mean, she would literally throw her clothes on the floor, dance, put her clothes back on, and it was the strangest thing I've ever seen. God,
Interesting.
that was a funny one.
So another one I want to ask about, just because I don't know if I've ever heard anything like it before, but I believe with Alcatrazz, while touring for the first album, you guys were at a gig in Boston when you were notified by the manager that Rockshire had been dissolved, and that the IRS would eventually seize the masters of the recording. Could you explain some of that?
Yeah, well, basically, Rockshire, I'll start at the beginning kind of quickly, but Rockshire was Rocky Davis and Shirley Davis. That's Rockshire. And Shirley was the accountant for the label, and Rocky was the president of the label. And Rocky was this guy, he'd been in prison, he was a biker, nicest guy, coolest guy. And Shirley worked for the Hughes Aircraft Corporation. And her job at the Hughes Aircraft Corporation, she was they had their own medical insurance. So Shirley was the one that paid all the bills, all of the doctors and the hospitals and everything. She was writing checks for years to Dr. Rocky Davis, and nobody questioned it. So they amassed millions, and we heard rumors of 13, 15, 18 million dollars, and that he had buried money in the desert. He'd buried money under houses. I mean, but anyway, so they were stealing money. And so at the record company, they owned a rehearsal place, like an industrial park. And they had this incredible rehearsal place where we rehearsed and put the record together. And then they had a studio right next to that where we recorded the album. And the offices were next to that. So all the people that worked there, everybody was there all the time. And Rocky was around all the time, loved the band. And we need money for something. Rocky would just pull it out of his pocket. He had a wad of $100 bills all the time. He would just pull the money out of his pocket and say, here, whatever you need. So we didn't question it. It was all good. All the people that worked there were all seasoned professionals, been around. And so it was a really good label. And Rocky was nice. Shirley was really nice. She was the bookkeeping, basically. And we didn't think anything about it. We made the record and everything was fine. We went on tour. They gave us tour support and all that. So then we hear that something's going on, that the IRS, that Rocky and Shirley got busted. And we didn't at the time really know what for. But our manager said, well, the IRS is going to take over everything. They're coming in to clean out. They're going to take everything. So, and Rocky and Shirley are going to jail, and the record company's over. So we were on the road, and then our manager talks to the president of the label, not just Rocky and the other guy, and they liked us. We got along with them great. They gave us a release. So we got off the label before the IRS brought the hammer down. And because we could have been tied up with that forever.
Wow.
We would have been, the IRS would have owned our contract. So we had a release, we got off. So then the IRS came in and literally put locks on the doors, changed the locks on the doors, took the typewriters, took everything. And all the masters out of the studio, everything. All the equipment out of the studio. Well, they just locked the door, basically. In the meantime, we were free and clear. The IRS they don't know Alcatrazz from anything. So to them, it was just like, well, who's on this record company, this label? And the list of artists was right here. And we weren't on that list anymore because we weren't technically on the label anymore. We'd gotten released. So we went over to Capitol Records immediately and got a deal. So we were very lucky. But yeah, Rocky and Shirley had been stealing money from Hughes Aircraft Corporation for for years. And they were spending money at the label just like it was insane. There was a keyboard out at the time that was about $4,000, and I really wanted one. It was a PPG, and great keyboard, really cool. And they had one at the studio, and I loved it. I wanted one, and I wanted to have one for myself and take it on the road. And Rocky said, no problem. So Rocky pulls out this wad of money, and he goes, let's find out. Let's get one now. Well, you couldn't get them. They weren't making them. They had a lull in production, so I couldn't get one. But he was just going to give me the cash and just go buy one. There was no purchase orders, or you got to talk to accounting. Let's have a meeting about this, or you guys are over budget, or there was no budget.
That's kind of amazing, because I think of like just all the countless bands who would say, okay, we went on tour, we sold a million albums, but we're still somehow in debt $250,000 to the record label. Like this sounds like almost like a better situation. Obviously didn't really turn out the best way, but
way better. And that had a lot to do with it, because we didn't have to worry about the checkbook. We just do whatever we needed. And Monday morning we'd go to rehearsal and we go, God, we really need this or that. And then our manager would just go get Rocky, and Rocky would come in the room and rehearsal. He'd hang out there and watch us a lot anyway. But he'd bring Rocky in, and Rocky would, what do you need? And whatever it was, piece of gear or whatever. And he'd go, okay, let's get it. And it would just show up. So yeah, a very unusual situation. And recording, there was no recording budget. I mean, somewhere on a piece of paper, I'm sure there was a number, $200,000 or $300,000 or whatever for the whole deal. But Rocky said to me right to my face, he goes, you guys, whatever you guys need, whatever you want, record as long as whatever it takes to make this record and break this band. I don't care. I don't care what it costs. Because he was probably thinking, if it takes $1 million, because $1 million to him at the time was nothing. Whereas, CBS records, they don't work that way. There's budgets and et cetera, for all record companies. So for Rocky, it was just this guy, this rich guy. But they had really good people that worked at the label. I mean, seasoned pros. So they knew they promoted the shit out of the record and did the right thing. We toured a lot, and they paid for they gave us tour support. We had a nice tour bus, and it was great. But then the hammer came down, and then eventually Rocky and Shirley both went to jail. And there were rumors he'd built a house in Laguna Beach, which I don't know if you're familiar with Laguna Beach, California, but that's that's big bucks. So he built a house in the hills, and Yngwie didn't have a place to live at the time, so he was staying in a place out in the San Fernando Valley. And then the record company, we got on the record deal, and Yngwie was staying at this house in Laguna Beach for a little bit, and Clyde Burr stayed there when he came over. This beautiful house that they had built in the hills in Laguna Beach overlooking the ocean. So somebody told me that when Rocky built that house, he had a box of money that he put under the foundation. Now, I have no idea if that's true or not. I don't know. So very strange.
Definitely. So have those masters ever been found, or is it most likely that they're still in possession by the IRS?
Well, I've heard different stories. I called the engineer that ran the studio. Dennis McKay engineered our record, produced and engineered that record, but Willie was the engineer that kind of ran the studio. So I was hearing different stories about where the masters. I got hold of Willie, And I called Willie, and Willie said, as far as he knows, Lester Claypool, Lester had built the studio for Rocky. And Lester was a horse's ass. He wasn't a good engineer at all. That's why Willie was there. And he was just a jerk. But he had worked his way in with Rocky and built the studio. And Willie said that Lester threw a bunch of masters in his car and took off before the IRS physically got there and took things. And then Willie said that he thinks that's a possibility. He said, did the Alcatrazz masters go with him? He doesn't know. He said, for all he knows, they could be sitting on a shelf there, and it could be sitting there on a shelf today. So he didn't, Willie wasn't sure. So that's as far as I could take it. And I asked Willie, I said, hey, really cool guy. I said, can you do a little investigating? Call me. And we talked about 3 months or 4 months later. And he said he couldn't find out anything. He said those buildings have been gutted a long time ago and the equipment sold, and anything that was in there, just God only knows who got it. So if the masters were still at the studio, they were gone. And if Lester took them, Lester died about 2 years after that. So who knows?
It's a great mystery.
Yeah.
So, another interesting thing I read about, I love watching the live videos from back then, with the first Yngwie obviously, and then Steve Vai. I love watching the live videos, but obviously, the Yngwie lineup didn't really last all that long. We can say due to creative differences.
Yeah.
But I read that it was actually a fist fight on stage in Oklahoma between Yngwie and Graham that, well, pretty much cemented that he was leaving. So being on stage and seeing that happen, what's running through your mind? I have to know.
Well, it wasn't, that's incorrect, actually. It wasn't a fist fight. What happened was Yngwie came out and was playing the first song, and Graham came out and tripped over Yngwie's cord and pulled him out of his guitar. So Yngwie flipped out and starts yelling at Graham, and Graham doesn't, he had no clue. He didn't know what Yngwie was talking about or anything. But Yngwie flipped out, basically, because he thought Graham did it intentionally, because Graham didn't like him. So we got back, there was no fist fight on stage, it was just Yngwie yelled at him, and that was about it. But we got back in the dressing room, and it got pretty heated, and Yngwie was just going off, yelling at Graham and threatening to hit him and stuff, and I kind of broke it up. I kind of stood in between them, said, shut up. And then I took Yngwie aside, and I said, look, we know this isn't working for you, and that you got to do your own thing. And I said, so that's okay. And Yngwie said, and he was cool. Yngwie said, yeah. He goes, I don't like working with Graham. And he goes, you guys are really cool, but I don't like working with Graham. And he goes, I got to do my own thing. I got to do my records, so, but I won't leave the tour. I'll finish out the tour before I leave. So I said, that's no problem. I said, I get it, and it was real adult. And I gave him a hug, and that was it. But he might have thrown a punch at Graham or something, but pretty harmless. I mean, it was all in the dressing room, but mostly just yelling and screaming.
So you're saying Yngwie actually did finish the tour then?
Yes.
Interesting. There's an interview with Steve Vai around 1990 where he says that Yngwie left the tour in the middle of the tour, and then he learned the set list in a day. And that didn't really seem to line up with everything else I was seeing.
Well, I think what Steve was probably thinking, Yngwie didn't really leave the tour. We finished the tour, and then Yngwie left. And that was what Yngwie and I talked about. So, but when we got Steve, we had dates. We had to play. So Steve did learn the stuff pretty much in a day. I mean, it was incredible how fast he learned it. and he played his ass off. So, all I would say is Steve was probably misunderstood or mistaken about that. He left the tour because Yngwie didn't actually lead the tour. But, and Yngwie today would probably tell you he left the tour, to be honest. Because Yngwie, it's like songwriting. We talk about, people ask me, well, who wrote this or who wrote that? And I wrote things, and Yngwie says he wrote everything. and, and Graham wrote the lyrics and the melodies. And I wrote a lot of the music with Yngwie. And, but Yngwie will tell you, that he wrote everything. And hey, that's okay. That's fine. Whatever. So.
While I guess while we're on the topic of songwriting, just because it's a personal thing of interest to me, I met Yngwie about maybe 3-4 weeks ago at one of the shows, and I was asking him about one of my favorite songs from like that early period, Evil Eye. And I saw in the a YouTube comment section, like the bridge part after like the second, chorus, where there's just like the rhythmic thing going bump, 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 bump. Bump, 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 bump. Exactly. I've read, they said, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. And I was asking, is that intentional? He says, yeah. So was that his idea or more of your idea? I'm curious.
No, that was Yngwie's. That was Yngwie's piece of music that he'd been playing for a while in Sweden. And so he was showing us the song. And the song was very easy. It was no big deal. And then he did this break. And he showed us this break. And I said, can you count that for me? Because I couldn't count it. I was just like...
it really is a random sort of rhythm of that until you realize it's just that.
Exactly. And I'm not this genius musician that just, can play anything. And I need count it, damn it. So he laughed and he goes, here's what it is. It's White Christmas. And he goes, and with the guitar in his hand, he goes, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones and he played, and then from then on, it was like we played it. It was nothing. It was easy, but that's where he got the idea. Yeah,
that's awesome.
It was cool. It worked fine.
I'm so happy that's true. So another question. So when Steve Vai joins the band, obviously, Steve Vai now is widely renowned as, an amazing guitar player. But back then, well, he had played with Frank Zappa, but I would argue that there wasn't as much crossover with like fans of Frank Zappa and more heavy music. So I've read that, Steve Vai has said himself, the very first show when he comes out on stage and people are chanting Yngwie, Yngwie, because that's who they're expecting, and they see him, he says that nobody clapped, but also nobody left.
And that's pretty much it. People were real reluctant to... well, they just weren't into it, into what Steve was doing. But the truth is, Steve was playing his ass off. And he played those songs. The thing is, he wasn't Yngwie, so it didn't matter how good he played. It would have never been okay for the fans because they wanted Yngwie and nothing less. So, and Steve is every bit, to say that he's every bit the player of Yngwie is putting it mildly. Steve's an incredible player.
Absolutely.
So when we played in Japan with Steve, we didn't play as big of places. Well, they're pretty big places, but we didn't do as well as we did that first tour with Yngwie. And so the first show in Japan, the lights went up, and it was about maybe 2,000 people. And Steve the whole show was built around this piece of music. But once he finished that and the solo, for his first big solo, Steve went sliding across the stage on his knees right to the front of the stage, and then he went down in the audience, and he just went nuts. And people flipped out. They loved it. And in that respect, he was blowing them away. But he still wasn't Yngwie. So I'm sure he got a lot of fans over there because of that, because he was great on stage, and the band was really good. With Steve, we rehearsed differently than we did with Yngwie. Rehearsals were way more disciplined, which I loved. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated on things. We worked on stuff. And, we concentrated and the band was really tight and really good. And but Steve just played his ass off, and it's what I've always loved about Steve. And he doesn't do it. So I've seen him recently. He doesn't do it as much anymore. There's spots in his show where he does, but basically for Alcatrazz, when I like how I found Steve was I'm friends with David Rosenthal. Do you know who he is?
I've heard the name before.
Well, a keyboard player. He played with Whitesnake and Rainbow and all these people. Incredible keyboard player. He's been Billy Joel's music director, keyboard player for 25 years. So when I called David and I said, "Hey David, somebody told me that you know a lot of guitar players," and so he goes, "I got the guy. Don't call anybody else." And David had gone to school with Steve at Berkeley, so he gave me Steve's number. And I called Steve. And we talked, and Steve was reluctant in the beginning to do the gig because he says, "I'm not Yngwie, and I don't want to be Yngwie, and I can't play like that." Well, the truth is he can. He just, what he meant was that that's not his thing, you know.
Sure.
And I basically going on David Rosenthal's word, I just pushed it. And I said, "Steve, you know, I know what you can do." He said, "Man, why don't we try it? You know, so come over and call it an audition, call it whatever you want, but we should play." So we got a really good rehearsal place, and Steve came over and played. And what I loved about the guys playing, and I still do to this day, is he plays with this attitude and this reckless abandon, I call it. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, he just taking the strings off the guitar, you know, and I love that. His technical ability goes without saying, you know, but I don't really care about that. I mean, that needs to be there for Steve to be Steve, but at the same time, he's got this energy, and Yngwie had the same thing, and that's what I love about Joe Stump. And I've worked with a lot of guitar players that don't have that at all, and they're incredible players, but they're boring. And Joe is not that guy. Joe plays like this is the last time he'll ever play guitar, you know, and takes the strings off the thing. And that's the way Yngwie played, and that's the way Steve played. And I loved it. So for me, and his interpretations of like the Alcatrazz material, I thought was great. And so we asked him to join the band. And it's funny because in the beginning, nobody wanted him. We finished that playing that day, and then Graham and I and Gary and Jan went over to a bar and sat and talked about it. And Graham hated him, and Jan hated him. And I just said, "You guys are out of your mind. This guy's amazing. What are you talking about?"
What did they like about him? I'm curious.
You know, they never said. It's just, you know, Graham and I'm assuming wanted more of an Yngwie clone and more of the perfect haircut, the perfect clothes, the typical rock star, you know, and that's not Steve. It wasn't then, and it's not now. So that's what they wanted. And I didn't give a shit about that. I didn't care if the guy wore I didn't care what he looked like. He played his ass off, and he was a great guy. So we started writing, or Steve wrote the bulk of that record. So we started writing, and the material was going great. And the album went well. It was a hard recording process because we were up against Christmas. So we were at Cherokee Studios in LA, and we had like 3 rooms going. I was recording Gary's bass in a room. Steve was cutting guitars with an engineer, and Eddie Kramer was mixing stuff that we had recorded. So and then we'd swap around, and Eddie would be cutting guitars and bass. And so it was insane doing that record that way. But it came out great, and I was really happy. The record was killer.
That's awesome. So on the topic of different guitar players you've worked with, I always find the addition of Danny Johnson to be interesting, just knowing that he views himself as more of a bluesy kind of player. I realized last night, I actually saw and met him with Steppenwolf when I was 13 back in 2013. So small world.
Yeah. Danny and I have been friends for years, And when Steve left the band, I won't mention any names, but I I knew I knew a lot of people, and I knew people that knew people. So I ended up talking to a lot of pretty up on the radar guitar players, and none of them were interested in the gig. And some of them told me, they said, well, once Ingve was gone, our direction changed, and they didn't want to be that way. So a lot of these guys weren't interested. And Danny and I talked, and Danny led me to believe that he was really into this, that he could do this. And I said, man, there's a lot of chops. I said, you got to play the Steve Vai stuff and the Ingve stuff. Oh, I can do it. I can do it. And it was my fault. I take complete responsibility for suggesting Danny, because Danny was not the right guy. And that record, Danny's not that kind of writer. And we lost the heaviness for that record big time. And Graham's not really much of a writer musically and direction wise. Graham's the kind of guy you just put a piece of music in front of him and he'll write a great melody and lyrics, but his music that he writes himself sounds like Johnny B. Good, so like Chuck Berry. So we needed a writer. So Danny and I wrote a lot of that, and we brought in some outside writers, some A-list, the biggest writers in the business, and they had demos of songs that they suggested. The record company at Capitol was all excited. Graham wouldn't do it. Graham wouldn't do the song. So, and basically told Capitol to fuck off. And that was the end of it with Capitol. I mean, it was all downhill from there. So, but Danny was not a writer. He didn't write the way we needed. Danny led me to believe that, oh yeah, he's way into this and he knows what to do. And it was not smart of me to just take him on his word. We should have gotten together and written some stuff and played and, sussed it out. But in a big hurry to do a record, same old story, had to get in the studio.
It's a bit of a shame, though. Danny wrote on his website where he talks about it. He says, sadly, Alcatrazz was my favorite band of that era, and I contributed to its breakup. That's what he says.
Right, and he did. Because Danny had his own idea of what it should be at some point. And Gary Shea's wife at the time was having a difficult pregnancy. So Gary didn't play bass on some of the tracks. So Danny suggested his cousin, Jay Davis, who had played with Rod Stewart and some other people. And Jay was an excellent bass player, but again, that took us farther away from the vibe. Jay was not a heavy rock bass player. Good bass player, but not, he didn't play like Gary. He wasn't that kind of bass player. So Danny at that point had visions of kind of taking over. Ironically, here he was not happening in the band, but he thought, well, he'll take Graham and Jay. And Jay played a part in that too, I'm sure. Telling Danny, yeah, let's just me and you and Graham. Because Graham didn't like me because I was, how to describe it, I knew I was trying to get things done. And I was fighting for those outside songs to keep Capitol happy. I was having meetings with Don Grierson, the president of Capitol. I could go in his office anytime I wanted and talk to him, and he's calling me. And Jimmy, we got to do these songs, And so Graham didn't like me because of that. So Danny talked to Graham into doing Alcatrazz. Well, whatever you want to call it. So it was Danny and Jay and Graham and Jan Uvina. And they didn't have a keyboard player. They didn't need a keyboard player, they thought. So they never recorded anything. They just talked about it, and in theory, that's what they wanted to do. But they never did anything. Because Danny's not a put it together kind of guy. Danny, if I was going to start a band with you, I'd be on your ass right now going, okay, so be it. Where are we going to meet and do this? We got to rehearse. Let's get it on. And Danny's not that guy. Jay Davis didn't give a shit. Jay Davis was just like, tell me where to be and I'll be part of it, And Graham doesn't know what day it is, much less being able to put together something. Graham's never organized anything in his life. I mean, nothing. He just does what he's told, or what, basically. So,
As a hypothetical, let me ask, do you think it'd be better, to be working with a band where there's a lot of people who aren't really like decision sort of people, or working with a band where everyone wants to be a decision person?
no, that doesn't work. Everybody being a decision maker, and that doesn't work. It's a really fine line. You need intelligent people. You need people that understand. The biggest thing is you need people that understand what you're trying to accomplish, because it is a business. And when you putting something together like that, you have to think about, well, what are we doing? Are we going to sell apples or oranges, or naked pictures of girls, or what are we doing? So somebody's got to lead that and direct that. And if you've got four other opinions that don't think that, well, no, it should be oranges. Well, no, it should be apples. Well, no. And then the other guy goes, no, it should be grapes. So that won't work. You'll never get that off the ground. So those guys have to be smart enough. Everybody's got to be smart enough to understand, like, hey, this guy's got really good ideas, and we should kind of go with, and that's what we did in New England. John Fannin was the main writer, and John had a good direction for that first record in particular. And I'd like to think we were smart enough to see that and went with it, and that's how we had our success. And the same in Alcatrazz, the first record. It was obvious that Yngwie was writing this really cool stuff, and I wrote some stuff with him in keeping with that direction. And Gary and Jan they were going with the flow because they felt good about it. They liked it. And Yngwie and I were writing it, putting it together, and Graham was writing the lyrics and melodies, and it was working great. So that's a case where Gary and Jan weren't writers, but they were smart enough to see what was going on, if this was going to be good, and it was good, and they liked it. So it just went. But I've been in bands where you've got four people that think that they know what it should be, and that'll never work. That just doesn't happen.
Sure. Too many cooks in the kitchen, as they say.
It really is that simple. It really is. There's nothing complicated about it or anything like that. It's just that simple.
So earlier this year, so Doogie White was singing with the band for roughly 4 years, but then it was announced earlier this year that he was leaving due to personal matters, and then that Giles would be stepping in. And I think, the question I was going to have, how much lead time, because obviously when that announcement was made, it was known that Giles was going to be singing. So I'm just curious how much time Giles had to actually learn all these songs.
Well, Giles had been singing. He knew the material really well, because when we were with Graham, Graham was running tracks. Giles was at the board controlling the vocals tracks, because Graham would try to sing something, and Giles would have him on a fader and have the track recording of him on a fader. Mm-hmm. And Giles would pull Graham out and just play the recording. So Giles knew those songs intimately. And then Giles would sing sound checks, because half the sound checks Graham wouldn't even show up. Or he didn't want to do a sound check. So Giles would sing them. So Giles was singing his ass off at these sound checks for a year at some of the sound checks, and he knew the songs. So there was no question in our mind. Doogie, it deteriorated. The situation with Doogie deteriorated to where it was obvious that he was going to go. So, and then it was a real natural thing. Giles just stepped right in.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking all the time to answer my questions and tell a few stories. Is there anything you want to promote before we finish?
Not really, because I got different things going on, and like I said, we could do this again. I would be happy to talk to you again and do this again if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, we should definitely do that at some point.
Okay, so why don't I'll email you or something, and then we'll set up another time. because I do have some more stories and stuff that I'd like to talk about.
Okay, that'd be awesome.
Okay. Well, cool, Max. I appreciate your time.
Yep, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You got it. I'll be in touch.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Gig Nightmares. Gig Nightmares is an independently produced podcast made possible by the support of listeners like you. If you enjoyed this week's episode, we would appreciate if you left a rating and a review for us. Gig Nightmares.